What if a mummy awakened after thousands of years only to mock the modern world? And what if the dead were wiser than the living? Welcome to Classic Storytime Hub. Tonight's tale is Some Words with a Mummy by Edgar Allan Poe, a classic tale reimagined and retold for the modern age.
The evening before had left my nerves in open rebellion. My head throbbed as if it were arguing with itself, and my eyelids felt unbearably heavy. Whatever grand plans I'd had for the night dissolved instantly. There was only one sensible option left to me: a modest bite of supper, then straight to bed. Modest, of course, is a flexible word. I have always held a deep affection for Welsh rabbit, an unreasonable affection, some might say. One portion is harmless, two are defensible. Between 2 and 3, the difference is almost philosophical rather than practical. I found myself drifting beyond such distinctions, perhaps to 4. My wife insists it was 5, but she fails to grasp an essential nuance. The number itself is irrelevant. What truly matters are the bottles of brown stout required to make the dish tolerable. In that sense, 5 was not indulgence, it was necessity. With this delicate matter resolved, I crowned myself with my nightcap and climbed into bed, convinced I would sleep peacefully until noon the following day. My conscience, blissfully unburdened, carried me into a deep and immediate slumber. Naturally, fate disagreed. I had barely reached my 3rd snore when the night exploded. The doorbell shrieked like an alarm, followed by an aggressive pounding on the knocker, sharp, urgent, merciless. I was jolted awake, disoriented and blinking, as my wife appeared at the bedside and pressed a folded note directly into my face. It was from my old friend, Dr. Poniner. The message was brief, but charged with excitement. He begged me to come at once, no delays, no excuses. After months of delicate persuasion, he had finally secured permission from the directors of the City Museum. Tonight, at last, he would examine the mummy, the one he had spoken of so often. He was authorized to remove the wrappings, even to open it if necessary. Only a few select friends would be present. I, of course, was expected. The mummy, he wrote, was already at his house, and at 11 o'clock that very night the unwrapping would begin. By the time I reached Poniner's house, sleep had completely abandoned me. Whatever fog had clung to my mind earlier was gone. I had launched myself out of bed as if electrified, scattering blankets and furniture alike, dressing with a speed that surprised even me. Within moments I was racing through the streets towards the doctor's door, fully awake and burning with anticipation. Inside, I found a gathering charged with restless excitement. Every face turned towards me as I entered. They had clearly been waiting. The mummy lay stretched across the dining table, commanding the room like a silent monarch. The instant I stepped inside, the examination began. This particular specimen was one of 2 recovered years earlier by Captain Arthur Sabretash, a relative of Poniner's. He had taken them from a burial chamber near Eletheus, hidden high within the Libyan mountains, far above the Nile and north of Thebes. While these grottos lacked the overwhelming grandeur of the famous Theban tombs, they held something far more intimate, glimpses into the everyday lives of ancient Egyptians.
The chamber that housed our mummy was said to be extraordinarily rich in such details. Its walls were smothered in frescoes and carved reliefs. Statues stood watch in the shadows. Ornate vases and intricate mosaics hinted at immense wealth and deliberate care. Whoever rested there had not merely been buried, they had been preserved with reverence and pride. When Captain Sabertash delivered the treasure to the city museum, it arrived untouched. The coffin had remained sealed exactly as it was found. For 8 long years it stood behind glass, admired only from the outside, never disturbed. Tonight, that restraint ended. The mummy was finally ours to examine. Anyone familiar with antiquities knows how rare such an opportunity truly is. Most relics reach us already stripped, damaged, or tampered with. To encounter an ancient burial in its original state was nothing short of extraordinary. We had every reason to feel fortunate. As I approached the table, my attention fixed on the container itself, a massive oblong case nearly 7 feet long, 3 feet wide, and deep enough to suggest something heavy and significant within. It was not shaped like a coffin, as one might expect. At first glance, we assumed it was carved from sycamore wood, but once a blade cut into its surface, the truth revealed itself. This was no wood at all. It was papier-mâché, layered, pressed, and hardened papyrus, fashioned with remarkable precision. Fragile in appearance, yet unmistakably deliberate. And whatever lay inside had been waiting, undisturbed, for centuries. The surface of the case was crowded with color and symbolism. Painted scenes unfolded across it, funeral processions, solemn rituals, figures frozen in gestures of mourning. Between these images, scattered in deliberate patterns and strange orientations, ran lines of hieroglyphs. They appeared again and again, repeating the same name, as if the dead were determined not to be forgotten. Fortune favored us that night. Mr. Glidden was among our company, and he examined the markings with calm confidence. The symbols, he explained, were not cryptic poetry or sacred riddles, but simple phonetics. Their meaning was unmistakable. They spelled a name, Alamistechio. Opening the outer case proved more challenging than we anticipated. The material resisted us stubbornly, and we worked carefully, unwilling to damage what centuries had preserved. At last, the lid gave way, and revealed a second container within. This one was shaped like a coffin, noticeably smaller than the first, yet identical in decoration and design. The narrow space between the two was packed with hardened resin, dark and glossy, its presence having blurred and stained parts of the painted surface beneath. When we opened the second case, far more easily than the first, we encountered yet another, a third coffin. It matched the second in form and proportion, but not in substance. This one was crafted from cedar, and as it was exposed, the air changed. A sharp, aromatic scent rose immediately, rich, dry, unmistakable, lingering proof of the wood's identity preserved across centuries. Unlike the earlier cases, there was no space between the second and third. They fit together with exacting precision, as though designed to become one.
At last, we removed the final case. The body itself lay within. We expected layers of linen, endless wrappings wound tight in ritual fashion. Instead, we found something entirely different. The form was enclosed in a rigid sheath of papyrus, sealed beneath a smooth coat of plaster. Its surface gleamed, thickly gilded and painted with extraordinary care. The images told a story, not of death, but of obligation. They depicted the soul's journey, its trials, its formal presentation before unseen gods. Repeated human figures appeared throughout, identical in face and posture, likely intended as idealized portraits of the embalmed man himself. Running straight down the body, from head to foot, was a single vertical inscription. The hieroglyphs were phonetic once more, clean and deliberate, listing his name again, his titles, his lineage, and the names and ranks of his family. This was no anonymous corpse. This was someone who expected to be recognized. Encircling the mummy's neck was a collar of cylindrical glass beads, each one catching the light differently. reds, blues, greens, arranged with careful intent. Together they formed sacred images, ancient gods, the scarab beetle, the winged sun hovering in silent authority. A second band of matching design rested around the narrow of the waist, like a ceremonial belt locking the body in place. When we carefully removed the papyrus sheath, a collective stillness fell over the room. The flesh beneath was astonishingly intact. There was no stench, no decay. Its color carried a muted reddish hue, the skin firm and polished, almost reflective. Hair still clung to the scalp. The teeth were complete and strong. The eyes, at least what appeared to be eyes, were not natural. They had been replaced with glass, exquisitely crafted and disturbingly lifelike, save for one detail. The stare was too fixed, too deliberate, as though locked onto a thought that refused to fade. The fingers ended in nails coated with brilliant gold, catching the lamplight with every subtle movement around the table. Mr. Glidden studied the body closely and suggested that the preservation was due entirely to asphaltum, judging by the skin's coloration. To test the theory, he scraped a small amount from the surface with a steel blade and cast the powder into the fire. The room filled with scent. Not smoke, not decay. Camphor, sweet, sharp, and other fragrant resins rose into the air, unmistakable and deliberate. This was no crude process. Whoever prepared this body knew exactly what they were doing. Then we searched for the familiar signs, the openings where organs were traditionally removed, the incisions, the marks, the evidence of ritual disassembly. We found nothing. No cut along the side, no trace of extraction, nothing beneath the skin to suggest intrusion. At the time, none of us understood how unusual, how rare that truly was. We assumed the old methods applied universally. The brain withdrawn through the nose, the entrails removed through a clean incision, the body shaved, washed, salted, and left to rest before the true work of preservation began.
Yet this body bore none of those signatures. Perplexed, Dr. Ponnonner reached for his instruments. If the evidence refused to reveal itself, he intended to uncover it by force. But before he could begin, I noticed the hour. It was past 2 o'clock in the morning. After brief discussion, we agreed to postpone any internal examination until the following night. Fatigue had crept into the room, dulling even our excitement. We were preparing to part ways, satisfied, for the moment, with what we had uncovered. That was when someone spoke. Quietly. What harm, they suggested, would there be in attempting a small experiment using the voltaic pile? The notion of applying electricity to a body that had been dead for 3, perhaps 4,000 years was, at best, questionable. Wise? Hardly. But original? Without doubt. The idea caught fire instantly. Half curiosity, half mockery, we assembled a crude battery in the doctor's study and carried the Egyptian there like actors staging an elaborate joke. None of us truly expected a result. With considerable effort, we exposed a portion of the temporal muscle, one of the few areas that seemed less rigid, less stone-like than the rest. Carefully, almost ceremonially, we brought the wire into contact. Nothing. No twitch, no response, no sign of life. That first attempt appeared conclusive. We laughed loudly at our own foolishness, congratulated one another on the absurdity of the experiment, and began exchanging farewells. Then I looked at the mummy's eyes. What I saw stopped me cold. They were no longer the same. The eyes we had dismissed as glass, those unnervingly lifeless orbs with their fixed, wild stare, were now partially veiled. The lids had moved. Not fully closed, but enough.
Only a narrow crescent of white remained visible beneath them. I shouted. Everyone turned. There was no denying it. The change was unmistakable. Strangely enough, I cannot say that I felt fear, at least not in the usual sense. Had it not been for the steady assistance of brown stout earlier in the evening, I might have felt differently. The others, however, made no effort to hide their terror. Dr. Podiner stood frozen, a portrait of disbelief. Mr. Glidden vanished entirely, as if swallowed by the room itself. And Mr. Silk Buckingham, well, I doubt he would ever admit it, but I am quite certain he escaped on all fours beneath the table. Once the first wave of shock had passed, reason, or something resembling it, returned. There was only one logical course left to us. We would continue. This time, we chose a more decisive target, the great toe of the right foot. With careful precision, an incision was made along the outer edge of the joint, exposing the root of the abductor muscle. The wire was positioned once more. The room fell silent. Every breath seemed suddenly loud. If the body still remembered life, this would be the moment it chose to answer. We adjusted the battery once more. This time, the current was applied directly to the exposed nerves. The response was instant. With a motion so vivid it defied reason, the mummy drew its right knee sharply upward, nearly folding itself in half. For a fraction of a second, the room froze. Then the leg snapped straight with impossible force. The kick struck Dr. Podiner squarely. He was launched backward like a projectile, vanishing through the window in a single violent arc, as though fired from a catapult into the night below. We bolted from the room in collective panic, certain we would find nothing but shattered remains on the street. Instead, to our astonishment, we met the doctor halfway up the staircase, racing towards us at an inexplicable speed, very much alive, radiating enthusiasm and overflowing with philosophical excitement. Far from discouraged, he was invigorated. The experiment, he insisted, must continue immediately, decisively, and with greater conviction than ever. At his urging, we made a deep incision at the tip of the mummy's nose. The doctor himself seized it without hesitation and forced it into aggressive contact with the wire. The effect, by every definition of the word, was electric. First, the corpse's eyes flew open and began blinking rapidly, absurdly, for several long seconds. Then it sneezed. Next, it sat straight upright. After that, it clenched its fist and shook it inches from Dr. Poniner's face. And finally, it turned. Facing Messrs. Glidden and Buckingham, the mummy spoke, not in groans, not in whispers, but in flawless, articulate Egyptian. Its voice carried irritation, sharp, controlled, unmistakably offended. It expressed surprise, then disappointment, then judgment. Dr. Podiner, it declared, was precisely what one might expect. A foolish, soft-bodied meddler, deserving of neither respect nor attention. He was dismissed with pity and forgiveness. But the others? They were a far greater disappointment. They had lived among Egypt's ruins, walked its sands, studied its language. They spoke Egyptian as easily as their own native tongue. They had always presented themselves as allies of the ancient dead, friends of the mummies, and yet they stood by, silent, while this indignity unfolded. What, the resurrected figure demanded, was it meant to think of such behavior? What exactly was he meant to assume, the mummy demanded, when complete strangers were allowed to strip him of his coffins and his clothing in a climate this unforgivably cold? And more to the point, how was he supposed to interpret our enthusiastic cooperation with that pitiful excuse for a scientist, Dr. Podiner, who had just dragged him around by the nose? Under such circumstances, one might reasonably expect a collective breakdown, a mad dash for the door, uncontrollable laughter, a room full of scholars collapsing like dominoes. Any of these reactions would have made perfect sense. And yet, none of them occurred. To this day, I cannot fully explain why. Perhaps it was simply the spirit of the age, that stubborn tendency to answer the impossible with calm indifference. Or perhaps it was the mummy himself, his tone so natural, so casual, that it stripped his outrage of its horror. Whatever the reason, the fact remains. No one panicked, no one screamed, no one even suggested that something had gone catastrophically wrong. As for me, I decided everything was perfectly acceptable and merely shifted a step sideways, just enough to avoid the range of the Egyptian's clenched fist. Dr. Ponnonner shoved his hands deep into his trouser pockets, fixed an intense stare on the mummy, and began turning a remarkable shade of red. Mr. Glidden stroked his whiskers thoughtfully and tugged his collar higher as though the room had suddenly grown drafty. Mr. Buckingham lowered his head, inserted his right thumb into the left corner of his mouth, and stared at the floor in silent contemplation. The Egyptian studied him for several long seconds. Then he sneered. "Well," he said sharply, "why don't you speak, Mr. Buckingham? Did you hear my question at all? And kindly remove your thumb from your mouth." Mr. Buckingham jolted slightly, obeyed at once, and withdrew his right thumb. After a moment's consideration, perhaps to restore some sense of balance, he promptly placed his left thumb into the right corner of the same opening. The mummy's expression did not improve.
Unable to get a straight answer from Mr. Buckingham, the mummy turned sharply to Mr. Glidden, voice sharp, commanding, as if daring him to explain the absurdity of the scene. Mr. Glidden responded at length in flawless Egyptian phonetics. Were it not for the lack of hieroglyphic type in American printing offices, I would gladly reproduce his entire masterful speech here. But suffice it to say, he argued with precision, eloquence, and the air of a man delivering a lecture to the ages. From that moment on, all communication involving the mummy unfolded in primitive Egyptian. For those of us unversed in its rhythms, including myself, the words were filtered through Messieurs Glidden and Buckingham, our interpreters. Their fluency was extraordinary. Every nuance, every gesture, perfectly rendered. Yet even masters can stumble when confronted with ideas centuries ahead of their time. Take, for example, the concept of politics. Mr. Glidden struggled to convey it until he resorted to drawing in charcoal a caricature on the wall. A small, sharp-nosed man, elbows akimbo, one leg back, fist raised, eyes rolling heavenward, mouth wide open at a perfect 90-degree angle. Only then did the mummy grasp the meaning. Similarly, the entirely modern notion of a wig eluded Mr. Buckingham until, at Dr. Ponnonner's suggestion, he paled and removed his own, holding it out as a demonstration. Even with such theatrics, the exchange retained an undercurrent of humor, the absurdity of modern objects explained to an ancient mind. The substance of Mr. Glidden's speech centered on the immense value to science of unrolling and examining mummies. He excused any inconvenience caused to the particular mummy before us, alla Mistacchio, and suggested, ever so politely, that now that misunderstandings were cleared, it might be appropriate to continue the investigation. At this, Dr. Ponnonner readied his instruments, the air thick with anticipation. The room, tense with excitement, held its breath. What would happen next? Would the secrets of millennia yield to the hands of the living? Or was something altogether unexpected waiting to emerge from the ancient gilded sheath before us? As for the Count's, alla Mistacchio's reaction to our suggestions, it seemed he had certain moral scruples. Their exact nature remained a mystery to me, but whatever they were, he appeared satisfied with the apologies we offered. With a measured dignity, he descended from the table and shook hands with each of us in turn. The ceremony concluded, we turned our attention to mending the damages inflicted by our overzealous scalpel.
A wound at the temple was carefully stitched, the foot was bandaged, a small square of black plaster was applied to the tip of the nose, restoring some semblance of normalcy. Even then, a faint tremor passed through him, no doubt the chill of the room, or perhaps a reflex of centuries-long preservation. Dr. Ponener wasted no time. He returned from his wardrobe bearing an astonishing ensemble: a black dress coat of Jennings' finest tailoring, sky-blue plaid pantaloons with straps, a pink gingham chemise, a brocade vest, a white sack overcoat, a walking cane with a hooked handle, a brimless hat, polished boots, straw-colored gloves, a monocle, a pair of whiskers, and a waterfall cravat. The size disparity between the Count alla Mistacchio and the doctor, roughly 2 to 1, made dressing a challenge. Yet with patience all was arranged. When finished, alla Mistacchio could at last be called properly attired.
Mr. Glidden, ever the gentleman, offered his arm and led the Count to a comfortable chair by the fire. Dr. Ponener, not missing a beat, summoned cigars and wine. The room warmed, not just from the hearth, but from curiosity, laughter, and the surreal thrill of the impossible. Conversation flowed naturally, though inevitably attention returned to the most remarkable fact of all, the Egyptians' continued vitality. "I should have thought," Mr. Buckingham ventured, "that by now you would be dead." The Count's astonishment was genuine. "Dead?" he echoed, eyes wide. "I am scarcely 700 years old. My father lived 1,000 and was far from feeble when he died. Surely you do not imagine I am yet finished." Laughter followed, mingled with awe and incredulity. Here sat an ancient being, centuries untouched by time, yet fully engaged in the manners, jokes, and curiosities of the modern world. The night had begun with the absurd and the impossible, but it ended with something even more extraordinary, a living relic of history, fully present, fully himself, and entirely unshaken by the centuries. A lively exchange of questions and calculations quickly revealed a shocking truth. The mummy's age had been vastly underestimated. He had lain in the catacombs at Eleuthius for a staggering 5,050 years, plus some additional months, to be precise. "But my remark," said Mr. Buckingham, "was not about your age at burial. I am willing to admit that you are still, by any reasonable standard, a young man. My confusion was about the sheer span of time during which you have been preserved in asphaltum." "In what?" asked the Count, brow slightly furrowed. "In asphaltum," persisted Mr. Buckingham, matter-of-factly. "Oh, yes," the Count replied, nodding slowly. "I have some vague notion of what you mean. It might indeed serve the purpose. But in my era we relied almost entirely on bichloride of mercury." Dr. Ponener leaned forward, hands on the table, eyes wide. "What completely baffles us," he admitted, "is how you, having been entombed in Egypt 5,000 years ago, are sitting here today, alive, alert, and looking remarkably well." The Count gave a small, amused smile. "Had I truly been dead," he said, "you may rest assured that I would remain so. Your galvanism is in its infancy. It cannot yet achieve what was ordinary practice in my day. The truth is, I fell into catalepsy. My friends, those who knew me best, assumed that I was either dead or soon would be. They embalmed me immediately." He paused, giving us a measured, almost theatrical glance. "I presume you understand the fundamental principle of embalming." Dr. Ponener shook his head. "Not entirely." The Count's expression shifted to one of mild exasperation. "Ah, a deplorable ignorance. Very well. I cannot enter into every detail at present, but understand this. To embalm properly in Egypt was to arrest indefinitely all the functions of the body. And when I say functions, I mean the word in its broadest sense, not merely physical, but moral and vital as well. Life itself was suspended, waiting until a time such as this."
"I repeat," the Count began, leaning slightly forward, voice calm yet carrying the weight of millennia. "The principal rule of embalming among us was this: to immediately arrest and hold indefinitely all the animal functions of the body. In simple terms, the condition in which the individual was embalmed, in that condition they remained. Alive, dead, or somewhere between, it mattered not. And as fortune would have it, I am of the blood of the Scarabaeus. Thus I was embalmed alive, as you see me now." Dr. Ponnonner nearly leapt from his chair. "The blood of the Scarabaeus?" "Yes," replied the Count with an air of serene patience. "The Scarabaeus was the insignia, or the heraldic symbol, of a distinguished, exceedingly rare patrician family. To be of the blood of the Scarabaeus is to belong to that lineage, figuratively speaking, of course." "And what does this have to do with you being alive?" "It is customary in Egypt," the Count explained, "to remove the bowels and brain of a corpse before embalming. The Scarabaei alone were exempt. Had I not been of that family, I would have been left without intestines and brain, conditions rather inconvenient for continued existence, I should think." "I understand that," Mr. Buckingham said gravely. "And I presume all the mummies that reach us are likewise of the Scarabaei line?" "Beyond question," the Count affirmed. Mr. Glidden, with a meek inflection, ventured, "I had thought the Scarabaeus was one of the Egyptian gods." "One of the Egyptian what?" The Count's eyes snapped open, his body rising abruptly from the chair. "Gods," repeated Glidden, voice trembling slightly. "Mr. Glidden," the Count said, resuming his seat with a mixture of reproach and exasperation, "I am astonished to hear such a statement. No nation on earth has ever acknowledged more than one god. The Scarabaeus, the ibis, and the like were nothing more than symbols, vessels, if you will, through which we offered worship to the Creator, too sublime to approach directly." A heavy silence fell over the room. The air seemed charged, waiting for the next words, the next revelation. Finally, Dr. Ponnonner cleared his throat and renewed the conversation, careful now to choose his questions wisely, knowing they addressed a being who had transcended time itself. "It is not improbable, then," I ventured, "that among the catacombs near the Nile there may be other mummies of the Scarabaeus line, still in a state of vitality?" "Beyond question," replied the Count, his tone calm, almost amused. "All Scarabaei embalmed accidentally while alive are alive now. Even some who were embalmed intentionally may have been overlooked by their executors, and still slumber in their tombs, waiting." "Excuse me," I said, leaning forward, "but could you explain what you mean by intentionally embalmed?" The Count regarded me leisurely through his monocle. He said with great pleasure, indeed with great pleasure. "In my time," he began, "the ordinary human life lasted about 800 years. Few died before 6 centuries, except by extraordinary accident, and few exceeded 1,000. 8 centuries was considered the natural span." He paused for effect, letting the weight of the statement sink in. "After the discovery of embalming, philosophers among us realized that one could gratify a most laudable curiosity, while simultaneously advancing the cause of science. It became possible to live a natural life in installments." His eyes gleamed as he continued. "Consider the historian. At 500 years he might labor over a monumental work, only to be carefully embalmed with explicit instructions to his executors. Revive me after a certain interval, perhaps 5 or 6 centuries. Upon resuming existence, he invariably discovers his masterpiece transformed, not destroyed, mind you, but altered, into a chaotic ledger of guesses, riddles, and the endless quarrels of commentators, past and present, all attempting to decipher his intentions. A ripple of astonishment passed through the room. It was one thing to witness a living mummy, but quite another to hear a centuries-old mind speak with such deliberate wit and ironic detachment. Here was history made flesh, and humor, centuries deep, lurking beneath the gilded surface. These guesses and annotations, the Count continued, his voice calm but carrying a subtle undertone of irony, which passed under the grand name of emendations, had such a way of enveloping, distorting, and overwhelming the original text that the author himself would often require a lantern just to locate his own work, and even when found, it was rarely worth the effort. He paused, eyes sweeping the room. Once rewritten, it became the historian's sacred duty to immediately correct from his private knowledge the prevailing traditions of the time concerning the epoch he had lived in. This process, rewriting and personal rectification, carried on by successive sages over centuries, was, in fact, the only thing that kept our history from degenerating into absolute fable. Dr. Ponenzer, ever cautious, gently laid a hand on the Count's arm. "Forgive me, sir," he interjected. "May I presume to interrupt for just a moment?" "By all means," replied the Count, lifting his head with polite curiosity. "I merely wish to ask," said the doctor, "you spoke of the historian correcting traditions of his own epoch. Pray, sir, on average, what proportion of these so-called Kabbalah were actually correct?" The Count's eyes sparkled with sardonic amusement. "The Kabbalah, as you properly term them, sir," said the Count, "were discovered to be in perfect parity with the unrewritten histories themselves. That is to say, not one iota of either was ever, under any circumstances, remotely correct." Dr. Ponenzer's brow furrowed. "But considering that at least 5,000 years have passed since your entombment, I presume your histories of that period, if not your traditions, must have been sufficiently explicit on one matter of universal interest, the creation, which, as I understand, took place only some 10 centuries prior." At this, the Count Alamostachio's eyes widened, and he straightened with a faint flash of incredulity. "Sir," he exclaimed, the single word carrying centuries of astonishment, disbelief, and the dignity of a man who had seen the rise and fall of empires. The doctor repeated his remarks, carefully emphasizing each point, but it took several patient explanations before the Count could grasp it. At last he spoke, hesitatingly, yet with the gravitas of centuries.
"The notions you present," he admitted, "are entirely new to me. In my time, never once did I encounter a mind bold enough to imagine that the universe, or this world if you insist, had a beginning at all. Once, and only once, a man of peculiar speculation hinted at the origin of humankind. He used the word Adam or red earth as you do, though quite differently. He spoke of spontaneous germination, 5 vast hordes of men rising simultaneously in 5 separate divisions of the globe, as the lower creatures are spontaneously produced from the soil. A ripple of incredulous amusement passed through the room. Several of us touched our foreheads with an exaggerated air of disbelief. Silk Buckingham, ever the bold observer, studied the contours of Alamostachio's head, first the occiput, then the sinciput, and ventured, with sly irony, "The remarkable longevity of human life in your era, combined with the occasional practice of living it in installments, must have strongly influenced the development and accumulation of knowledge.
I presume, therefore, that the striking inferiority of the ancient Egyptians in all scientific matters, when compared to moderns, and especially to Yankees, is to be attributed solely to the superior solidity of the Egyptian skull. The Count regarded him with a polite yet quizzical expression. "I confess once more," he said suavely, "that I find your meaning elusive. Pray, to which particulars of science do you refer?" At this, the entire company spoke in unison, elaborating with great gusto the curious assumptions of phrenology, the marvels of animal magnetism, and other modern marvels. The Egyptian listened, eyebrows slightly arched, as though weighing the absurdity and brilliance of our claims, his silence a perfect blend of judgment and amusement. After patiently listening to our endless chatter, the Count leaned back in his chair, a faint smile playing on his lips, and began to recount a series of anecdotes that left no doubt prototypes of Gaul and Spurzum had existed and vanished in Egypt so long ago that they were nearly forgotten, while the feats of Mesmer seemed laughably trivial when compared to the miraculous accomplishments of Theban savants, who, it seemed, could create lice and countless other astonishing curiosities. I ventured a question. "Were your people able to calculate eclipses?" The Count's smile took on a faintly contemptuous edge. "Of course," he said with the air of someone answering a child. Taken aback, I shifted to more general inquiries about his astronomical knowledge, but a quiet whisper interrupted me. A member of the company, silent until now, leaned over and suggested consulting Ptolemy, whoever he might be, and a certain Plutarch de Facie Lunae. Turning back to the Count, I asked about burning glasses, lenses, and in general the art of glass-making, but barely had I begun when the silent adviser nudged me again, imploring me, under his breath, to consult Diodorus Siculus. The Count, meanwhile, regarded me with polite amusement and posed a question of his own. "Do you moderns possess microscopes fine enough to cut cameos in the style of the Egyptians?" Before I could answer, the ever-enthusiastic Dr. Panona leapt into the fray. "Look at our architecture," he cried, much to the visible irritation of both travellers, who pinched him black and blue to no avail. "Observe the Bowling Green fountain in New York, or if that is too vast a contemplation, consider for a moment the Capitol at Washington, D.C., The doctor went on with relentless detail, describing every architectural proportion. The portico alone, he explained, boasts no fewer than 24 columns, each 5 feet in diameter and spaced 10 feet apart. The Count raised an eyebrow, while the others exchanged glances, half amusement, half incredulity, wondering if any modern marvel could ever match the wonders of Egypt's ancient enigmatic masters.
The Count sighed, a gesture of centuries weighing on him. "I regret," he said, "that I cannot recall at this very moment the precise dimensions of any principal building in the city of Aznak, foundations laid in the very night of time itself. Yet, at the moment of my entombment, the ruins still stood, stretching across a vast plain of sand west of Thebes." He paused, thinking of porticos. "I do remember one at a lesser palace in a suburb called Karnak. Its portico alone boasted 144 columns, each 37 feet in circumference and spaced 25 feet apart. To reach it from the Nile, one would pass along a 2-mile avenue lined with sphinxes, statues, and obelisks soaring 20, 60, or even 100 feet into the sky. The palace itself, if memory serves, stretched 2 miles in one direction, forming an estimated circuit of 7 miles. Its walls, inside and out, were richly painted with hieroglyphics. He smiled faintly.
Now, Doctor, I would not dare claim that even 50 or 60 of your capitals could have been placed within these walls, but perhaps 200 or 300. With considerable effort, I dare say it might have been possible. After all, that palace at Karnak was but a modest dwelling compared to the grandeur of its day. He inclined his head with a touch of generosity. I must, however, admit the ingenuity and magnificence of your bowling green fountain. Nothing like it has ever been seen in Egypt or anywhere else. It is a marvel, I grant you that. I ventured a question, and your thoughts on our railroads, Count? He shook his head gently. Nothing in particular. They are slight, clumsy, poorly conceived. They cannot compare, of course, with the vast, level, iron-grooved causeways we used to transport entire temples and solid obelisks, some 150 feet high across the desert. And our gigantic mechanical forces, I pressed. The Count's eyes glimmered with the faintest hint of amusement. Ah, your machines, impressive, perhaps, for your time, but they are still children, fumbling with tools compared to the deliberate and awe-inspiring feats of Egyptian ingenuity. The Count gave a polite nod. Yes, you have your accomplishments, he said, but tell me, how would you even begin to lift the heavy lintels of a palace like that at Karnak? I wisely chose not to answer, and instead asked if he knew of artesian wells. He raised a single quizzical eyebrow. Glidden, ever discreet, leaned close and whispered that engineers had recently discovered one in the great oasis. Encouraged, I brought up our steel. The Count sniffed delicately. And you imagine your steel could carve the precise, sharp inscriptions on obelisks, he asked, all done with copper edge tools in my time? We exchanged embarrassed glances. Clearly brute force and metallurgy were no match for the cunning of ancient Egypt. So we changed tactics, moving the conversation toward metaphysics. We produced a book called The Dial and read aloud about what Bostonians intriguingly call the Great Movement of Progress. The Count chuckled. Great movements, he remarked dryly, are frightfully common in my day. Progress, as you call it, at one time it was quite a nuisance, and it never truly progressed.
We tried another angle, democracy. We extolled its beauty, its freedoms, the advantage of universal suffrage without a king. The Count listened with interest and a growing smile. Once we had finished, he leaned back and began a story of his own. A long time ago, 13 Egyptian provinces decided all at once to be free, he said. They assembled their wisest men and created the most ingenious constitution imaginable. For a while, things went remarkably well, but their pride was enormous. In the end, however, the 13 states, along with 15 or 20 others, were consolidated under the most insufferable despotism ever seen on earth. His tone was both amused and resigned, as though mocking the eternal human hope that liberty might ever last unchallenged. I asked the Count the name of the usurping tyrant. As far as I can recall, he said calmly, it was Mob. I had nothing to reply to that, so, raising my voice, I launched into a loud lament about the Egyptian ignorance of steam power. The Count stared at me in genuine astonishment, but said nothing. The silent gentleman, however, drove his elbow sharply into my ribs and whispered that I had disgraced myself enough for one evening. He then demanded to know whether I was truly foolish enough not to realize that the modern steam engine descended directly from the invention of Harrow by way of Solomon de Cause. At this point, our intellectual ruin seemed inevitable, but fortune, ever fickle, favored us once more. Dr. Ponnonner recovered his courage and rushed gallantly to our defense. Surely the people of Egypt cannot pretend to rival the modern world in the all-important matter of dress? The Count looked down slowly at the straps of his pantaloons. Then, delicately lifting one of his coat-tails, he examined it with intense concentration. After a long pause, he let it fall. His mouth stretched gradually from ear to ear, but he offered not a single word in reply. We took heart. Emboldened, the doctor stepped forward with great dignity and demanded that the mummy answer honestly, upon his honor as a gentleman, whether the Egyptians had ever understood the manufacture of Ponnonner's lozenges or Brandreth's pills. We waited, breathless. No answer came. The Egyptian blushed. He lowered his head. Never was triumph more complete. Never was defeat endured with such silent misery. I could not bear the sight of his humiliation. Taking up my hat, I bowed stiffly and took my leave. When I reached home, it was past 4 o'clock. I went directly to bed. It is now 10 in the morning. I have been awake since 7, writing these memoranda for the benefit of my family and of mankind. I shall see the former no more. My wife is a shrew. The truth is, I am thoroughly sick of this life and of the 19th century in general. I am convinced that everything is going wrong. Besides, I am extremely anxious to know who will be president in the year 2045. As soon, therefore, as I shave and swallow a cup of coffee, I shall step over to Dr. Ponnonner's and have myself embalmed for a couple of 100 years.
And thus the story ended. If you liked this journey into the worlds of classic literature, do not forget to support us by subscribing so we can tell you more. And hey, if there's a classic tale you'd love to hear told in this suspenseful style, drop its name in the comments below. Your suggestion might be our next chilling adventure.